Kansas, May 1945. The transport truck lurched to a stop, its brakes hissing in the thick afternoon heat. Greta Hoffman pressed her palm against the metal bench beneath her, steadying herself as the vehicle settled. Through the canvas flap at the rear, she could make out shapes, blurred and indistinct, moving against a backdrop of pale sky and darker structures. She squinted, trying to force her eyes to cooperate, to bring the world into focus. It had been 3 years since she could see clearly beyond arm's length. 3 years of headaches that felt like iron bands tightening around her skull. 3 years of holding reports inches from her face, of memorizing weather patterns because reading the instruments made her eyes water with strain. The truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang that made her flinch. American voices called out, sharp and foreign. Greta stood with the other women, her legs unsteady after hours of travel, and climbed down into the Kansas dust. The heat hit her immediately, dry and relentless, so different from the damp cold of the weather station where she had worked until the surrender. She had expected many things as a prisoner of war. Hunger, certainly. Interrogation. Hard labor. Perhaps cruelty. What she had not expected was the building before her, a low wooden structure with screens on the windows, painted white, looking almost like a school or a hospital. The blur of it made her eyes ache. A woman in an American uniform, speaking German with a thick accent, directed them toward the building. Medical processing, she said. Routine examinations. Greta's stomach tightened. She had heard stories, whispered rumors of what happened to prisoners, especially women. But there was nowhere to go except forward, following the woman ahead of her whose dark hair she could see clearly but whose face remained a soft smudge. Inside, the building smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint, not the rot and mildew she had grown accustomed to in the final months of the war, when supplies dwindled and everything felt like it was decaying. This smell was clean, almost aggressively so. Greta was directed to a chair in a small room with a desk and examination table. The walls were a pale green, or perhaps blue. She could not quite tell. A man entered, older, with gray in his hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He introduced himself as Dr. Morrison, his German halting but understandable. He asked her to sit, to relax, that this was simply a health assessment. He began with basic questions. Her name, her age, her role in the military. When he slid a form across the desk for her to read, she leaned forward, squinting at the typed words. They swam before her eyes, the letters bleeding into one another. She brought the paper closer, 6 inches from her face, trying to make sense of the questions. Her head began to throb, that familiar pressure building behind her eyes. Dr. Morrison stopped writing. She heard his chair scrape back. Then his voice, gentle, asking her something she did not immediately understand. He repeated it. How long had her vision been like this? Greta looked up at his blurred face, startled by the question. She had not expected anyone to notice, let alone care. She told him, 3 years, since 1942. She had requested eyeglasses, she explained, her voice flat, reciting facts as she had been trained. Multiple requests, all denied. Resources were needed elsewhere. Her vision was not critical to her duties. She could still read instruments if she got close enough. She could still record data. The headaches did not prevent her from working. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and left the room. Greta sat alone, her heart beating faster than it should. She did not know what she had said wrong, what regulation she had violated by admitting her weakness. When he returned, he was not alone. Another man accompanied him, younger, carrying a black leather case. Dr. Morrison explained that this was Captain Ellis, an optometrist. They were going to test her vision. Now, today. Greta stared at the blurred shape of the doctor, not comprehending. An optometrist. For her. A prisoner. A defeated enemy. It made no sense. Captain Ellis set up equipment on the desk, instruments she could not see clearly but could hear clicking and adjusting. He asked her to cover one eye, then the other. He held up cards with letters asking her to read them. She could not from any distance. He moved closer. Still, the letters remained indistinct. He made notes, his pencil scratching against paper. Then he opened the leather case and began removing lenses, small circles of glass in metal frames. He held them up to her eyes, one after another, asking each time if it was better or worse, clearer or more blurred. Greta answered mechanically, her mind struggling to process what was happening. With each lens, the world shifted, sharpened slightly, then blurred again. Captain Ellis worked methodically, patiently, adjusting and testing. And then suddenly, a lens clicked into place and the world snapped into focus. The letters on the card were crisp, black against white, each one distinct and readable. Greta gasped, a small, involuntary sound. Captain Ellis smiled. She could see it now, see the lines around his eyes, the exact shape of his mouth. He asked if that was better. She nodded, unable to speak. He continued testing, refining, adjusting. When he finished, he told her through Dr. Morrison's translation that he would have eyeglasses made for her. It would take a few days, less than a week. She would be able to see clearly again. Greta sat very still. The words did not seem real. Eyeglasses, made for her, a prisoner, in less than a week. For 3 years she had been told no. For 3 years her requests had been stamped with rejections, marked as non-essential, frivolous, a waste of resources that were needed for the war effort. She had accepted it as she had accepted everything else. Sacrifice was necessary. Individual comfort was irrelevant. The Reich needed every resource, every scrap of metal and glass for victory. Her vision was not important enough. She was not important enough. But here in this camp, in this enemy country, an optometrist had spent an hour testing her eyes. Equipment had been brought. Lenses had been tried. And now eyeglasses would be made for her. Because she could not see, because that mattered. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Greta stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing to leave, needing air. Dr. Morrison guided her gently back to the chair, his hand on her shoulder, steady and impersonal but not unkind. He told her to sit, to breathe. She obeyed because obeying was what she knew how to do. But her hands were shaking, and she could not make them stop. 4 days later, Greta was called back to the medical building. She had spent those days in a strange limbo, assigned to a barracks with other women, given meals that were more food than she had seen in months, told to rest and wait for processing. The camp was not what she had imagined. There were fences, yes, and guards, but the barracks were clean. The beds had mattresses and the latrines had running water. It was disorienting, this lack of deprivation. She kept waiting for the other reality to reveal itself, for the cruelty she had been taught to expect from the enemy. Captain Ellis was waiting for her in the same small room. He held a case, brown leather, worn at the edges. He opened it and removed a pair of eyeglasses. Wire frames, simple and functional. He gestured for her to sit, then carefully, gently, placed them on her face, adjusting the arms behind her ears, making sure they sat properly on her nose. Greta looked up. The world was sharp. Every detail, every edge, every line was clear and distinct. She could see the grain in the wooden desk, the individual hairs in Captain Ellis's eyebrows, the stitching on Dr. Morrison's uniform. She could see the texture of the wall, the screws in the light fixture above, the words on the poster behind the doctor's head. She could read them, easily, without strain, without pain. Captain Ellis handed her a piece of paper, a page from a book. He asked her to read it aloud. Greta took the paper, held it at a normal distance, not pressed to her face, and began to read. The words flowed, clear and effortless. Her voice faltered halfway through the first paragraph. She tried to continue, but her throat closed, her vision blurring not from poor eyesight but from tears. She set the paper down, removed the glasses, and pressed her hands to her face. The sobs came suddenly, violently, shaking her entire body. She could not stop them. She had not cried when the war ended, when everything she had believed in collapsed. She had not cried during the transport, during the uncertainty of what would happen to her. But now, sitting in this small room, holding a pair of eyeglasses that had been made for her in 4 days, she wept. Dr. Morrison and Captain Ellis did not speak. They did not tell her to stop, did not reprimand her for the display of emotion. They simply waited, letting her cry until the sobs subsided into ragged breathing. When she finally looked up, wiping her face with her hands, Dr. Morrison handed her a handkerchief. She took it, pressed it to her eyes, and put the glasses back on. Everything was still clear. It had not been a dream. Captain Ellis asked, through the doctor's translation, if the glasses felt comfortable, if they needed any adjustment. Greta shook her head. They were perfect. He smiled and told her they were hers to keep. She could wear them all the time. If they broke or needed repair, she should report to the medical building. Greta held the glasses in her hands after removing them, staring at the lenses, the frames, the small screws that held everything together. These had been made for her. Resources had been allocated. Time had been spent. An optometrist had examined her, tested her, fitted her with lenses. A craftsman somewhere had ground glass to her prescription, assembled frames, created these glasses specifically for her eyes. Because she could not see, because that was enough reason. She thought of the form she had filled out in 1942, requesting eyeglasses. She had been precise, professional, outlining how her deteriorating vision was affecting her work, how she was making errors in recording data, how the headaches were becoming debilitating. The response had been swift and unambiguous. Denied. Non-essential. Resources allocated to critical needs. She had submitted another request 6 months later, after a particularly bad week where she had misread a barometric pressure reading and been reprimanded. Denied again. She had stopped asking after that. She had learned to cope, to adapt, to hold papers close and squint and endure the pain. She had told herself it was her duty, her sacrifice for the greater good. Everyone was sacrificing. Her vision was a small thing compared to the soldiers at the front, compared to the cities being bombed, compared to the enormity of the war. But it had not been a small thing. It had been her eyes, her ability to see the world, to do her work without pain, to read, to function. And it had been dismissed as frivolous, not by bureaucratic oversight or wartime chaos, but by deliberate decision. Her well-being had been weighed against other priorities and found wanting. She had been found wanting, and she had accepted it. She had internalized it. She had believed that her suffering was necessary, that her needs were selfish, that asking for help was weakness. She had given everything, her time, her energy, her health, her loyalty, and it had not been enough. It had never been enough, because the system she served did not value her as a person. It valued her as a function, a tool, useful only as long as she could perform her duties. When she could no longer perform them adequately, she was discarded, her requests ignored, her suffering irrelevant. But here in this camp, in this country she had been taught to hate and fear, her suffering had been noticed. A doctor had seen her squinting and asked why. An optometrist had tested her vision and made her glasses. In 4 days. Without hesitation, without forms or denials or dismissals, because she could not see, and that was reason enough to help her. Greta put the glasses back on and looked around the room. She could see the cracks in the plaster, the dust motes floating in the sunlight through the window, the expression on Dr. Morrison's face, concerned but patient. She could see clearly. And with that clarity came a realization that was more painful than any headache she had endured. The country she had served, the system she had believed in, had not cared about her. Not truly. It had demanded her loyalty, her sacrifice, her absolute obedience, and in return it had given her nothing. Not even a pair of eyeglasses. Her captors, the enemy, had given her more in 4 days than her own military had in 3 years. Not because they owed her anything, not because she had earned it, but simply because she needed it. Because her vision mattered. Because she mattered. The weight of that realization settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. Everything she had believed, everything she had been taught was crumbling. She had been told that the enemy was cruel, barbaric, that prisoners would be tortured and starved. She had been told that the right cared for its people, that every sacrifice was for the greater good, that loyalty would be rewarded. But the evidence before her eyes, literally before her eyes, told a different story. She thought of the meals she had been given in the camp. Plain, yes, but plentiful. Bread, soup, vegetables, even meat. More food than she had seen in the last year of the war, when rations had dwindled to almost nothing. She thought of the barracks, clean and dry, with beds and blankets. She thought of the medical examination, thorough and professional, treating her not as an enemy but as a patient. And now, the eyeglasses. Each act of basic human decency was a hammer blow against the foundation of everything she had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the enemy be more humane than her own side? How could prisoners be treated better than soldiers? How could her captors care more about her well-being than her commanders? The only answer was one she did not want to face, that she had been lied to. That the system she served was not what she believed it to be, that her loyalty had been exploited, her sacrifices wasted, her suffering unnecessary. Dr. Morrison asked if she was all right. Greta nodded, though it was not true. She was not all right. She did not know if she would ever be all right again. But she could see. For the first time in 3 years, she could see clearly, and she could not unsee what that clarity revealed. Over the following weeks, Greta wore her glasses every day. She read books from the camp library, devouring words she had been unable to access for years. She wrote letters, her handwriting neat and precise now that she could see the lines on the paper. She observed the camp, the routines, the interactions between prisoners and guards. She truly saw, how the camp operated. There was discipline, yes, and rules, but there was also a fundamental respect for the prisoners as human beings. They were fed, housed, given medical care. They were allowed to write letters, to receive packages, to organize activities. There were classes, language lessons, even a small theater group. It was not freedom, but it was not the horror she had been taught to expect. And with each day, the contrast between her treatment as a prisoner and her treatment as a soldier became more stark. She remembered the weather station, the cold, damp rooms, the inadequate heating, the meager rations. She remembered the constant pressure, the demands for accuracy and efficiency without the tools or support to achieve them. She remembered the dismissal of her needs, the expectation that she would simply endure, that her suffering was irrelevant. She had believed it was necessary. She had believed it was her duty. But now, seeing how easily her basic needs could be met, how simple it was to provide eyeglasses or adequate food or clean housing, she understood that it had not been necessary. It had been a choice. A choice to prioritize other things over the well-being of the people who served. A choice to demand sacrifice without offering care in return. Greta spoke with other women in the camp, sharing stories, comparing experiences. Many of them had similar realizations, similar moments of cognitive dissonance. The gap between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing was too wide to ignore. Some clung to their old beliefs, insisting that the Americans were simply trying to manipulate them, that the kindness was a trick. But Greta could not make herself believe that anymore. The eyeglasses were not a trick. They were real, solid, functional. They allowed her to see. And what she saw was the truth. One evening, sitting in the barracks with her glasses on, reading a book by the light of the electric lamp, Greta felt a strange sense of peace. Not happiness exactly. The grief and confusion were still there, the sense of betrayal and loss, but also a quiet acceptance. She had been wrong. The system she believed in had been wrong, and now she could see clearly it was a beginning. Not of forgiveness or redemption, but of understanding. Of recognizing that she had been used, that her loyalty had been exploited, that her suffering had been unnecessary. And with that recognition came a small, fragile sense of agency. She could choose now what to believe. She could choose how to move forward. The eyeglasses had given her more than clear vision. They had given her clarity, the ability to see the world as it was, not as she had been told it should be. And that clarity, painful as it was a gift from her captors, who had treated her with more humanity than her own side ever had. Greta closed the book and removed her glasses, holding them in her hands. She thought of Captain Ellis, carefully adjusting the frames on her face. She thought of Dr. Morrison, noticing her squinting and asking why. She thought of the casual efficiency with which they had addressed her need, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if she mattered. She put the glasses back on and looked around the barracks. She could see the faces of the other women, some reading, some talking, some sleeping. She could see the details of their lives, the small acts of resilience and adaptation. She could see clearly, and she would not forget, not the kindness of her captors and not the cruelty of those she had served. Both truths were now visible, sharp, and undeniable. The eyeglasses had changed everything. Not just her vision, but her understanding of the world. And there was no going back to the blur, to the comfortable ignorance of not seeing. She could see now, and she would have to live with what that clarity revealed. In the months that followed, Greta continued to wear her glasses, to read, to learn, to process. The war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. For her, and for so many others who had believed and served and sacrificed, only to discover that their loyalty had been betrayed. The eyeglasses became a symbol, a reminder of the moment when everything changed. When a simple act of care from an enemy revealed the profound lack of care from her own side. When clarity, both literal and metaphorical, shattered the illusions she had lived by. Greta Hoffmann would eventually return to Germany, carrying her glasses with her, a tangible reminder of the day she learned to see. Not just the world around her, but the truth of the system she had served. And that truth, once seen, could never be unseen. The glasses had been made in 4 days. The realization they brought would last a lifetime.